In October of 1976, on a 60-acre block of flat, dark-loam wheat ground 3 miles east of Hillsboro, Kansas, a 52-year-old widow named Verna Friesen drilled 480 pounds of heritage turkey, red, hard red winter wheat seed her great-great-grandfather Hans Friesen had carried in a sealed lard tin from the Crimean village of Alexanderwohl across the Atlantic in steerage in 1874, and her father, Peter Friesen, had kept in continuous family cultivation on the same Marion County section for 48 consecutive years between 1928 and 1976. The seed was 102 years old when Verna planted it. It had been refreshed every single year of those 102 years by some member of the Friesen family without a single outcross to any commercial variety. The original lard tin had been replaced in 1923 with a sealed glass jar that Hans Friesen's son Heinrich had bought from a Hillsboro mercantile, and that had remained the official foundation seed container of the family line from 1923 until the morning of December 11, 1975, when Verna's father, Peter Friesen, had died at 81 of pneumonia in the front bedroom of the same farmhouse where the glass jar was still sitting on the kitchen shelf. Verna Friesen had inherited the home place. The 1968 John Deere 4020 tractor, the 1962 Massey Ferguson grain drill, the 1973 Chevrolet C30 grain truck, the family Bible, the leather-bound seed register her grandfather Heinrich had started in 1909, and the glass jar of turkey red foundation seed. She had been 51 years old in December of 1975 when her father had died. She had been 52 in October of 1976 when she drilled the heritage wheat on the home place block. Instead of the new Triumph 64 hybrid line every other operator in Marion County had been running since 1969. The men at the Hillsboro Cafe laughed for an hour and 50 minutes when they heard. They were still laughing 9 years later, in the third week of June 1985, when a sudden Fusarium head blight epidemic moved across the central Kansas wheat belt and devastated the modern semi-dwarf hybrid stands from Hutchinson to McPherson, and the only standing clean wheat crop in 8 townships of Marion County was the Friesen 60-acre block of 1874 turkey red east of Hillsboro. By the autumn of 1976, the agricultural orthodoxy of the central Kansas wheat belt had reached the cleanest expression of its 100-year arc. The orthodoxy was simple. The heritage open-pollinated wheats, Turkey Red, Can Red, Tenmark, Pawnee, Triumph, had been the foundation of Kansas wheat production from the 1874 immigration of the Mennonites until the late 1950s. The modern semi-dwarf hybrid wheats, Centurk, Eagle, Sage, the Triumph 64 line, were the foundation of Kansas wheat production from 1959 forward. By 1976, 96% of the standing winter wheat acreage in Marion County was in Triumph 64 or one of its semi-dwarf relatives. The remaining 4% was in old line heritage stands maintained by retired Mennonite farmers who refused to throw out their father's seed. The remaining 4% was, in the professional consensus of every Kansas State University agronomist between Manhattan and Garden City, a sentimental holdover that would be gone within a generation. The Marion County Extension agent in 1976, a man named Otto Jansen, who had served in the same office for 23 years, said it openly to anyone who would listen. He said it standing at the front of the Marion County Wheat Growers Association meeting. He said it sitting at the counter of the Hillsboro Cafe at 7 in the morning. He said, heritage wheat in 1976 is the kind of crop a man plants to honor his grandfather. It is not the kind of crop a man plants to make a living. The Friesen widow is honoring her father. Nobody should mistake the gesture for a business decision. It was not a controversial position. It was the professional consensus of the Kansas State University Wheat Improvement Program, of the Marion County Extension Service, of the Kansas Wheat Commission, of every grain elevator from Hillsboro to McPherson to Hutchinson. It was the consensus that heritage turkey red could not compete on yield, could not compete on standability, could not compete on harvest timing, and could not compete on grain test weight against the modern semi-dwarf hybrids. It was the consensus that Verna Friesen was throwing away a 60-acre block on a sentimental tribute to a dead father. Verna Friesen had been raised on a different consensus. Her great-great-grandfather, Hans Friesen, had been born in 1838 in the Mennonite village of Alexanderwohl in the Molochna colony in the Torrid Governorate of the Russian Empire on the steppes north of the Crimean Peninsula. He had grown up farming hard red winter wheat. The Mennonite community had developed over 4 generations of selection from a Mediterranean dryland line crossed with a South Russian steppe line. The wheat had been called Krimka by the Mennonite farmers in the Crimea. In 1874, when the Russian government revoked the military exemption that had brought the Mennonites to the Molochna in the 1780s and demanded that all young men serve in the Tsar's army, Hans Friesen and his wife Aganitha had been part of a community decision to emigrate to the United States. Hans Friesen had been 36 years old. He had been a deacon in the Alexanderwohl Mennonite Brethren congregation. He had been a member of the 7-man delegation the village elders had sent in the spring of 1873 to scout American farmland for the community's relocation. The delegation had ridden the new transcontinental railway from New York to Topeka in April of 1873 and had been met at the Topeka depot by an agent of the Santa Fe Railroad who had walked them across the central Kansas grasslands of Marion, McPherson, Harvey, and Reno counties for 6 consecutive days. The Santa Fe Railroad had owned in 1873 every odd-numbered section across a 15-mile-wide land grant from the Missouri border to the Colorado state line. The Santa Fe had offered the Alexanderwohl community a single contract to sell 60,000 acres of Marion and McPherson County prairie at $3.25 per acre, payable over 10 years, with a 5-year property tax abatement and a 1-year free homestead period option. The delegation had walked the soil. Hans Friesen had taken a handful of central Kansas loam from a section the agent had identified as suitable for hard red winter wheat, and he had carried that handful of soil back to the Alexanderwohl village in a small cloth pouch tied at his belt. The pouch had been opened on the night the village elders had met to vote on the relocation. Hans Friesen had passed the soil around the meeting. The vote had been unanimous. 820 Mennonite families had committed to the move within 60 days. Hans had carried in a sealed tin lard can in the bottom of his steamer trunk 214 pounds of Krimka wheat seed selected from the 1873 Alexander wool harvest. The lard tin had crossed the Atlantic in October of 1874. Hans Friesen had homesteaded the same Marion County section Verna now owned in March of 1875. He had drilled the Crimea in September of 1875. The line had been renamed Turkey Red by the Central Kansas farming community within 10 years because the Mennonite community had been mistakenly believed to have come from Turkey by Kansans who could not place the Crimea on a map. Hans Friesen had farmed the Turkey Red on the home place section from 1875 until his death in 1928. His son, Heinrich Friesen, had farmed the line from 1928 until 1947. Heinrich's son, Peter Friesen, had farmed the line from 1947 until his death in 1975. Verna Friesen, the only surviving child of Peter and Helena Friesen, had inherited the line in December of 1975. She had read her grandfather Heinrich's 1909 to 1947 seed register 4 times in the first 3 months of 1976. She had read her father Peter's 1947 to 1974 seed register 3 times. She had read the family Bible's interleaved yield records from 1875 to 1907, written in Old German cursive by Hans and Agatha Friesen, twice. She had tested the 1975 foundation seed for germination in the kitchen window in March of 1976 at 93%. The seed was alive. She had decided by the second week of August 1976 that she would drill the entire 60-acre home place block in Heritage Turkey Red in the fall of 1976. She had told no one in Marion County what she was planning. She had cleaned the 1962 Massey Ferguson grain drill alone in the equipment shed for 3 weekends in late August and early September 1976. She had calibrated the seed rate from her grandfather Heinrich's 1934 handwritten calibration chart, set the row spacing to 12 inches as Hans Friesen had documented in his 1875 first planting notes, and replaced 6 worn double-disc opener bearings with new bearings she had ordered from the John Deere dealer in Newton for $38. She had cleaned the foundation seed by hand in the kitchen over 4 consecutive evenings in the 3rd and 4th weeks of September. She had run the seed through a hand-cranked seed cleaner her grandfather Heinrich had built in 1936 from a wooden box and a set of brass mesh screens her great-grandmother Agatha had brought from the Crimea. She had weighed every bushel on the brass and wood platform scale her father Peter had bought at the Hillsboro Implement Co-op in 1948. She had divided the 480-pound planting stock into 8 cotton seed bags of 60 pounds each, labeled in pencil with the planting date, the row sequence, and the source jar identification number from the leather seed register. She had told her hired man Linus Jansen on the Thursday before the planting that she would be drilling wheat the next Saturday. She had not told him what kind of wheat. By the morning of the first Saturday of October 1976, when Gerhard Bachmann drove past the Friesen home place on his way home from the Hillsboro Mennonite Brethren Church, and saw Verna following the 1962 Massey Ferguson grain drill on foot with a leather satchel of seed slung over her shoulder and a hand-rebuilt seed rate calibration on the drill, the block was already half drilled. By the second Tuesday of October, 1976, every farmer in Marion County had heard. The Hillsboro Cafe sat on Main Street between the Marion County Bank and the Hillsboro Co-op Grain Elevator, and on Tuesday and Friday mornings between 5:30 and 7, the long Formica counter filled with men in tall, crowned, cream and tan stockman's cowboy hats drinking coffee from chipped enamel mugs and arguing about the price of hard red winter wheat at the Kansas City Board of Trade and the prospects for the spring wheat planting north of the Smoky Hill River, and the question of whether the new federal farm bill would change the Kansas wheat allotment formula. The Friesen widows' 60-acre heritage planting had become the dominant topic of conversation by the third week of October. Gerhard Bachmann, who farmed 840 acres of hybrid Triumph 64 winter wheat and grain sorghum on the section south of the Friesen home place, had told the story at the counter 4 mornings in a row. He had told it again at the October Wheat Growers Association meeting. He had told it once more at the Hillsboro Mennonite Brethren Church coffee hour on the second Sunday of October. By the end of October, he had told it in some form to every farmer within 40 miles of Hillsboro. The story changed slightly with each telling. By the time it reached Otto Jansen at the courthouse on the morning of October 27th, the story was that Verna Friesen had drilled an entire 60-acre block on her dead father's 100-year-old immigrant seed and was claiming, on the authority of her grandfather Heinrich's 1909 seed register, that the heritage line would outperform the modern hybrid in some unspecified bad weather year. The mockery in Hillsboro was not cruel. It was a kind of small-town disbelief that wore the clothing of concern. At the elevator on Wednesday afternoon, Verna heard a man named Abraham Ratzlaff, who had grown up next door to her father Peter on the family section in the 1920s, tell another customer that the Friesen widow had let her grief get the better of her judgment. At the Marion County Bank on the Saturday before Thanksgiving, the bank manager pulled Verna aside after she had finished a routine deposit and asked her, in a low and respectful voice, whether she had thought through what the 60-acre yield gap was going to do to her household budget over the next 5 years. At the Hillsboro Mennonite Brethren Church potluck on the third Sunday of October, the minister's wife pulled Verna aside in the basement fellowship hall and asked her in a careful voice whether the heritage planting was something Heinrich would have approved of. Heinrich was Verna's late husband, who had died of a tractor accident in 1971. Verna had looked at the minister's wife across the corner of a folding card table that held a covered casserole and a glass pan of Zwieback rolls, and had said, "Heinrich would have asked me what my father thought." The minister's wife had said nothing. Verna had carried her green bean casserole back to the kitchen and washed her own dish. Gerhard Bachmann had been Heinrich Friesen's best friend for 31 years. They had attended Tabor College together in the late 1940s. They had been groomsmen at each other's weddings. Gerhard had been one of the pallbearers at Heinrich's funeral in 1971. He had stopped by the Friesen house every other Sunday afternoon for the first 2 years of Verna's widowhood, bringing covered casseroles his wife Liesel made and asking, in the tone of a friend who was simply being practical, whether Verna had thought about selling the home place and moving into town. He had offered to disc her stubble in the fall. He had offered to combine her wheat for her at no charge in the summer. He had told her more than once that any decision she wanted to make about the operation would have his full support. Verna had thanked him. She had not sold. She had not moved. She had run the operation herself in 1972, 1973, 1974, 1975, and now 1976, with the help of her late father until December of 1975 and a part-time hired man named Linus Jansen since 1971. The heritage planting changed the conversation. Gerhard heard about it from Linus Jansen, who had helped Verna drill the block, but had not been told what the seed was until they were halfway through. Linus had told Gerhard at the elevator on the Monday morning. Gerhard had not believed him. Gerhard had driven past the Friesen home place himself on the Tuesday afternoon and had counted, by the rough estimate of a man who had drilled wheat for 40 consecutive autumns, somewhere between 58 and 62 acres of freshly drilled wheat ground, showing the distinctive tall stalk emergence pattern of a heritage line, rather than the compact early growth of the Triumph 64 hybrid. Gerhard had driven home to his wife Liesel at 6 in the evening and had sat at the kitchen table with his hat off and his elbows on the oilcloth, and had said, "Liesel, my best friend's widow, has lost her mind." Liesel Bachmann had set down a coffee pot and had said, "Gerhard, you do not call her your best friend's widow in front of me ever again. She is Heinrich's wife, and she is my goddaughter's mother, and she is 52 years old, and she has buried a husband and a father, and her mother and most of her family in 9 years. You will go over there tomorrow, and you will ask her what she has done, and you will listen to the answer." Gerhard Bachmann had gone over the next morning. Verna was standing at the south end of the drilled block with a leather-bound seed register open in her left hand and a thin pencil in her right, when she heard Gerhard Bachmann's truck pull up to the gate. She did not turn around. She finished the round notation she was writing. She closed the register. She walked across the freshly drilled ground to the gate. "Gerhard, Verna, you want coffee?" No. She had expected the question. She had expected the visit, although not on this particular Wednesday. She crossed her arms. She waited. "Linus told me yesterday," Gerhard said. "I came over today. I drove past the block yesterday and I counted somewhere upwards of 60 acres of heritage drill. I came home and I asked Liesel to set me straight. Liesel told me to come ask you. Verna, what in God's name have you done?" I drilled the entire home place block in turkey red. The 1874 line my great-great-grandfather Hans Friesen brought from the Crimea. The seed my father refreshed every single year for 48 years. The line in the seed register my grandfather Heinrich started in 1909. I drilled it at 120 pounds per acre on 12-inch row spacing, exactly as Hans Friesen drilled it on this same section in September of 1875. Verna, Gerhard, you drilled a 102-year-old open-pollinated heritage line on a section that should have been in Triumph 64. The Triumph 64 will out-yield turkey red by 16 bushels per acre on this soil type. Your 60-acre yield gap at the current wheat price of $3.10 a bushel is $2,976. You are throwing away $3,000 on a sentimental gesture to your dead father. Verna, I can drill you Triumph 64 next week. I have 140 bushels of certified seed in the loft of my equipment shed. I will sell it to you at the co-op price. I will run the drill myself. I will charge you no labor. You can disc the heritage planting under in the next 2 weeks. You can owe me for the seed until next August. Drill the Triumph 64. The hybrid is the future. The heritage is the past. Gerhard, my great-great-grandfather Hans Friesen, carried that seed across the Atlantic in steerage in 1874 because the Tsar's army was going to take his sons. My grandfather Heinrich Friesen carried that seed through the 1934 drought, the 1936 drought, the 1953 stem rust epidemic, the 1957 stem rust epidemic, and a 1947 spring tornado that took every modern wheat stand within 12 miles of Hillsboro. My father, Peter Friesen, carried that seed through the 1965 hailstorm. Every one of them carried it because they knew the day was coming when the hybrids would fail us in a year nobody was expecting. The day is closer than you think. I am not drilling Triumph 64. I am drilling the line. I am drilling it every year until I die, or the line dies, whichever comes first. The bad year, when it comes, will be the year the line was kept for. Gerhard, you cannot wait a decade for one bad year. I am not waiting a decade for one bad year. I am farming the line every year because that is what my father did, and his father before him, and his father before him. The 40 bushels an acre is enough to pay the property taxes, pay the seed bill, pay the fertilizer, pay the diesel, and clear me a small profit. The bad year, when it comes, will be the bonus. I am not asking you to understand this. I am telling you what I am doing so you do not have to ask me again. Gerhard Bachmann took his hat off, then put it back on, then took it off again. He looked across the freshly drilled block. He looked back at Verna. He said, "Verna, I cannot stop you. I cannot help you. I am going home. I will watch what happens." He drove home. The 1977 wheat harvest came in late June. The Friesen home place block yielded 42 bushels per acre on the dry side of the section and 45 on the wet side. The grain test weight was 63 pounds per bushel against a Marion County hybrid average of 58. The grain protein was 13.7% against a hybrid average of 11.2. Verna sold the entire harvest to the Hillsboro Co-op grain elevator at the cash price of $3.04 a bushel. The total revenue was approximately $7,800 on the 60-acre block. After fuel and seed and fertilizer and the property tax allocation, the net was $3,400. The Bachmann 840-acre Triumph 64 operation at the same time netted $46,000. The Bachmann operation netted on a per-acre basis $55 an acre. The Friesen operation netted on a per-acre basis $57. Gerhard Bachmann did not, in the summer of 1977, attribute the per-acre difference to the heritage line. He attributed it to lower input costs on a smaller block. The 1977 harvest was, for Gerhard Bachmann, not yet a story about the line. If you have ever drilled seed your great-great-grandfather carried across the Atlantic, if you have ever heard your father's voice in a 1909 seed register and decided to listen to him over every county extension agent and every seed dealer and every banker in your county, this story is for you. Stay with us. There is one of these stories in every county in America, and the one we are telling you today comes from Marion County, Kansas, in the summer of 1985, 9 years after Verna Friesen drilled the home place block in Turkey Red. The years between 1976 and 1985 were the deep work years. Verna Friesen harvested the home place block every June. She refreshed the seed every year on a 5-acre selection plot at the north end of the section. She kept the breeding records in pencil in the same leather seed register her grandfather Heinrich had started in 1909, adding her own notes in the back pages. She sold the harvest grain to the Hillsboro Co-op every summer. She sold a small reserve of selected seed to 3 retired Mennonite farmers in McPherson and Reno counties who had been keeping their own heritage lines and who had heard about the Friesen Turkey Red from a 1978 article in the Wheat Life magazine that had described the heritage planting without naming Verna. The seed sale revenue was small, between $400 and $700 a year. By the end of 1981, the home place block had become, in the unofficial assessment of every Marion County farmer who drove past on Highway 56, the most reliably productive 60 acres in the county. The Heritage Turkey Red consistently produced 42 to 46 bushels per acre with no irrigation supplementation and minimal nitrogen input. The Triumph 64 hybrid blocks on the same soil type produced 58 to 64 bushels with full irrigation and maximum nitrogen. But the per-acre net was lower because the input costs were so much higher. The men at the Hillsboro Cafe stopped making jokes about the heritage line in 1980. They simply stopped making them in front of Verna Friesen. The mockery moved sideways. By 1981, it had become a mockery that focused on the unusualness of the operation rather than on its performance. The men at the counter said that Verna had gotten lucky on input costs. They said that the real test would come when the central Kansas wheat belt had a serious bad year. In the winter of 1982, Verna received a letter from a researcher at Kansas State University in Manhattan named Dr. Margit Klassen. Dr. Klassen was an associate professor of agronomy. Her research program focused on heritage line wheat genetic resources. She had published in 1981 a paper in Crop Science titled Pre-Green Revolution Turkey Red Wheat, a survey of operator-maintained heritage plots in central Kansas. Verna had read the paper. She had bought a reprint from the journal office for $1.25. She had written Dr. Klassen a letter on January the 7th, 1982, on a sheet of lined notebook paper and pencil, describing her family's 1874 vintage Turkey Red line, her grandfather's 1909 to 1947 seed register, her father's 1947 to 1974 register, the 1976 planting, and the 5 years of yield records. Dr. Klassen had answered 3 weeks later. She had said yes. She had said she could come in the spring of 1982. Dr. Margit Klassen arrived at the Friesen Gate on the morning of April 23rd, 1982, in a 1979 dark blue Buick Skylark with 2 graduate student assistants from the Kansas State Agronomy Department in the back seat and a yellow hard hat on the front passenger floorboard. She introduced herself to Verna at the gate. She asked to walk the home place block on foot before they did anything else. Verna walked her out. The April light was long across the freshly greening winter wheat stand. Dr. Klassen knelt at the 3rd row. She measured the tillering. She turned to Verna and she said, "Mrs. Friesen, the tiller count on this stand is 28% above the Triumph 64 reference plot at Manhattan. The stem caliper is 14% thicker. The leaf area at this stage is 17% larger. The root crown is set 2 centimeters lower in the soil profile. I have not seen anything like this in 11 years of fieldwork on Kansas heritage wheat. I am here for 1 day. May I have 4? Verna gave her 4. Dr. Klassen walked the block over 4 consecutive 12-hour days. She measured tillering at 64 sample points. She recorded stem caliper at 32 subsample points. She took soil cores at 12 sites for organic matter and microbial community analysis. She collected 160 individual head samples for kernel hardness testing, grain protein analysis, and falling number measurement. She collected 88 leaf samples for rust resistance assay. She sampled the seed register every 40 pages and photographed the family Bible's interleaved yield records on every page where Hans Friesen's 1875 to 1908 entries had been preserved. She recorded the breeding history all the way back to the 1873 Crimean selection at the Alexanderwold village. She confirmed by leaf rust resistance testing that the Friesen Turkey Red carried a complete suite of stem rust and leaf rust resistance genes that the modern Kansas hybrids had lost during the post-1959 yield selection regime. She also identified at the Kansas State Pathology Laboratory in Manhattan, 3 weeks after her field visit, 4 previously uncharacterized gene loci in the Friesen line that were associated with Fusarium head blight tolerance, 3 of which had been independently identified in a 1979 Chinese wheat genetics paper, but had never been mapped in any American wheat collection. She returned to the kitchen on the 4th evening. She sat across the Formica table from Verna. She said, "Mrs. Friesen, your family's 1874, 1928, 1947, 1975. Selection history is, by my professional assessment, the longest continuous unbroken heritage line cultivation history of any Kansas wheat operation in the historical record. The line you are growing is genetically distinct from any modern variety. It carries complete spectrum gene complexes for stem rust resistance, leaf rust resistance, Fusarium head blight resistance, and drought escape that the Kansas State hybrid breeding programs eliminated in the 1960s in favor of grain yield selection. Your line is, in my professional assessment, the only standing field expression of pre-1928 immigrant turkey red in the state of Kansas as of April 1982. I am going to publish this. I will not name you. I will refer to your operation as a private cooperator. The agronomy community is going to spend the next 30 years trying to recover what your great-great-grandfather already had in 1874, Verna said. Don't use my name. Dr. Klassen did not use her name. She published between 1983 and 1985 3 papers in Crop Science, Agronomy Journal, and the Journal of Heredity that referenced the Friesen operation only as Cooperator G. The papers were read by every wheat geneticist at every land-grant university in North America. None of them found Cooperator G. Then the summer of 1985 arrived. The spring of 1985 had opened wet in central Kansas. April rainfall in Marion County had been 4.2 inches against a 30-year average of 2.8. May rainfall had been 6.1 inches against an average of 3.4. The standing winter wheat had entered the boot stage in the first week of June under saturated soil and a persistent warm, humid air mass that pushed dew points into the high 60s from May 28th onward. The conditions were perfect for Fusarium graminearum, the soil and residue-borne fungus that causes Fusarium head blight, commonly called scab. The first symptoms appeared in the Triumph 64 stands in the second week of June. The florets bleached pink and white at the top of the heads. The kernels shrank inside the developing glooms. The whitened sections spread down the head from the top. The infected florets turned brittle and shattered at the slightest wind. By the third week of June, every Triumph 64 field in Marion County showed visible head blight infection. By the fourth week, the county-wide loss was projected at 58% of the standing crop. Gerhard Bachmann's 840-acre operation by the morning of June 25th was projected at 63% loss. The Bachmann operating note at the Marion County Bank had been written in March of 1985 at $140,000 against the expected June harvest. The note had a covenant requirement that the wheat harvest proceeds clear at least 70% of the operating note principal by July 15th. The Bachmann operation on the morning of June 25th was looking at harvest proceeds of approximately $32,000 against a covenant requirement of $98,000. The note would be called by the bank in the second week of July if no alternative source of funds appeared. Gerhard Bachmann had stopped sleeping. He had been in the field at 4 a.m. every morning of the third week of June with a hand lens and a notebook, walking the rows of his Triumph 64 stand and counting the bleached florets, trying to convince himself that the infection might still recede. The infection had not receded. The infection had spread. The Marion County Extension Office in Hillsboro, on the morning of June 26th, filed a federal disaster declaration request with the United States Department of Agriculture. The Friesen 60-acre block of Turkey Red on the same morning of June 26th showed 8% infection. Verna had walked the block at first light. She had inspected every fifth row from the south fence line to the north. She had pulled a single sample head from every 10th station. She had broken the heads open by hand and inspected the developing kernels with a hand lens her grandfather Heinrich had bought at a Hillsboro hardware store in 1934. She had counted the infected florets on each sample. The mean infection rate across her 240 sample heads had been 7.93%. The infections were scattered, not clustered, and they were concentrated on the tertiary tillers rather than on the main stems. The main stems carried over 90% intact heads. Verna had walked back to the kitchen at 8 in the morning. She had written the count in the leather seed register in pencil. She had drawn a small map of the block on the facing page and had marked the 4 worst infection patches with crosshatch shading. She had set the register aside. She had then made a cup of strong coffee, sat at the kitchen table for 20 minutes without speaking, and decided that the harvest would still go forward on schedule because the 8% infection level was inside the acceptable salvage range her grandfather Heinrich had documented during the 1953 stem rust epidemic at 14%. The 1874 line carried, as Dr. Klassen had documented in 1982, a complete spectrum gene complex for Fusarium head blight resistance that the Triumph 64 had lost. The taller stems held the heads above the most humid layer of canopy air. The longer flowering window distributed the susceptibility across 2 weeks instead of concentrating it in a single high-risk 3-day flowering period. The thicker glooms physically resisted spore penetration. The Friesen block, on the morning of June 26th, was the only standing clean wheat crop in 8 townships of Marion County. By the end of the third week of June 1985, every farmer in Marion County had heard. The story did not change in the telling. The hybrid was bleached. The heritage was standing. By the end of July, the Kansas Wheat Industry Press had picked it up. By the end of August, Dr. Margaret Klassen at Kansas State was on the phone with Verna Friesen asking permission to expedite a follow-up paper. The 1985 harvest came in the first week of July. The Friesen home place block yielded 38 bushels per acre, 9% below the 8-year average, exactly as Verna had estimated in late June. The grain test weight was 63 pounds per bushel. The protein was 13.8%. The total harvest was 2,280 bushels. The cash price at the Hillsboro Co-op on July 7, 1985, was $4.98 a bushel, the highest wheat price the central Kansas market had seen in 11 years, because the regional Fusarium losses had collapsed the supply. Verna sold at the spot price. The total revenue was $11,354. After fuel and fertilizer and the property tax allocation, the net was $7,200. It was less than her 8-year average net. It was the only positive net any wheat operation in Marion County recorded that year. By the end of July 1985, the Friesen operation had also taken in $17,400 in cash from a different revenue stream that nobody outside the operation had anticipated. The Marion County and adjacent county hybrid wheat farms had lost not only their 1985 harvest, but also their planned 1986 seed stock saved from the 1985 harvest. The certified Triumph 64 seed for the 1986 planting season would have to be bought new from commercial seed producers at prices that had climbed 30% on the regional shortage. Or the central Kansas wheat belt could buy heritage turkey red seed from the only standing source in the state. The first telephone call came on June 29th from a Reno County farmer named Wendell Buhler. The second came on June 30th. By the morning of July 1st, Verna had taken 11 calls. Gerhard Bachmann's son Ernst drove over to the Friesen gate on the morning of July 3, 1985, 6 days after the Fusarium projection had moved to 63% on his father's operation. He arrived at 7:30. He sat in the cab of his 1982 Ford F-150 and watched Verna walk from the milk house to the home place block with a cotton seed bag on her shoulder. She saw him at the gate. She walked over. She set the bag on the gate post. She stood at the driver's side window. Ernst, Aunt Verna, you want coffee? No. I came over to ask a question. My father didn't send me. He doesn't know I am here. We have lost 63% of the standing crop on the home section. We are looking at replanting 840 acres in the fall of 1985 with a seed bill we cannot float at 30% above spot Triumph 64 prices. I came over today to ask if you would sell us heritage seed for the fall planting. I do not know how much you have. I do not know what you would charge. I came to ask. Ernst Bachmann was 29 years old. He had his father's tall, lean build and his mother, Liesel's, hazel eyes. He wore a faded blue ball cap and a denim jacket over a brown plaid pearl-snap shirt. He had not, in the 14 years since Heinrich Friesen had died, ever asked Verna Friesen for a single thing. He asked now. Verna set the seed bag on the post. She said, "Ernst, I will sell you seed. The price is $7 a bushel, cash on delivery, payable in early September for delivery in mid-September from my 1985 harvest reserves. The minimum order is 40 bushels. The order includes one consultation visit from me at your operation in mid-September to set up the drill and to walk the seedling stand at 4 weeks. The fee covers that visit. There will be no follow-up consultation included in the price. If you want follow-up, the rate is $65 an hour." Ernst Bachmann said, "Aunt Verna, I am in." Word travels in Marion County. By the end of July 1985, Verna had received 48 telephone calls from farmers in 5 counties who wanted heritage turkey red seed for the fall 1985 planting. Verna sat at the kitchen table on the evening of August 5, 1985, with the leather seed register and a pencil. She wrote down what she could supply. She had retained from the 1985 harvest approximately 1,400 bushels of cleaned heritage seed. At 120 pounds per acre and a 60-pound bushel, 1,400 bushels was enough seed to plant approximately 700 acres at standard density. She decided on the evening of August 5th that she would sell to a maximum of 30 farms at a maximum of 48 bushels per farm on a first-come, first-served basis from the existing telephone call list. The total revenue, if all 30 orders came in at the maximum, would be $10,080. The follow-up consultation revenue, if half the farms signed on for spring and summer visits at $65 an hour, would be substantial. Verna would work 70 hours a week from late August through October, supervising orders and consultation visits and refreshing her own seed reserves. She would hire Linus Jansen full-time at $13 an hour. She would teach the next generation of Marion County and McPherson County and Reno County wheat farmers what her great-great-grandfather had carried across the Atlantic in 1874. By the second week of September 1985, 30 Central Kansas wheat operations had signed seed contracts. The Bachmann operation took 48 bushels. The first seed shipments left the Friesen home place in 50-pound burlap bags on the morning of September 14, 1985. Verna supervised every load. By the morning of October 1, 1985, the seed had been distributed to 30 Central Kansas wheat farms, and Verna had visited each to walk the drill setup and the first seedling emergence. She drove the 1973 Chevrolet C30 grain truck a total of 934 miles between September 15th and October 1st, from the Bachmann section south of Hillsboro to a 160-acre operation outside of Inman, Kansas, to a 320-acre farm in Harvey County, to a small dryland operation in northwestern Reno County, to a 180-acre farm in eastern Rice County. She arrived at every gate at first light. She walked every drill setup with the operator. She corrected the seed rate calibration on 17 of the 30 operations where the drill had been set for Triumph 64 density rather than for the heavier per bushel turkey red. She corrected the row spacing on 9 operations. She refused to charge for the corrections. She refused to charge for the extra trips. She drove home at dusk every night and slept in her own bed and started over at 4:30 the next morning. Each farm received the same consultation document, 16 typed pages, hand-typed by Verna on her grandfather Heinrich's 1928 Underwood Standard typewriter. The document included the planting density. It included the row spacing recommendation. It included a winter seed storage protocol. It included the annual seed refreshment cycle. It included Hans Friesen's 1875 hand-drawn drilling rate calibration. It included a one-page note in Verna's handwritten cursive that said, in part, "Do not cross-breed with hybrids. Do not buy seed from anyone else. Do not skip the refreshment cycle." The line was carried across an ocean for the bad years. The bad years will come again. Gerhard Bachmann drove over to the Friesen gate on a cold Saturday afternoon in mid-November, 1985, 6 months after the Fusarium projection had landed on his operation. The 1985 Fusarium harvest had been hauled to the elevator at 22 cents a bushel salvage prices. The 1985 federal crop insurance payout had landed in the Bachmann bank account in October at 60% of the prior year baseline. The 1985 operating note at the Marion County Bank had been brought current by the federal disaster payout and Ernst's seed purchase loan from Verna. The Bachmann section was not lost. The 1986 winter wheat planting was already in the ground, drilled in heritage turkey red on every acre of the Bachmann operation. The drilling had been done by Linus Jansen and Ernst Bachmann, working a single shift each day from sunrise to sunset over 11 consecutive days in the 3rd and 4th weeks of September 1985. Verna had supervised the seed rate calibration on the morning of the first day. She had ridden the drill alongside Ernst for the first 3 rows. She had stepped off, walked the headland, and watched the drill complete the first 10 acres without correction. She had then driven the C-30 home and had not returned to the Bachmann section during the entire planting because Ernst Bachmann needed to learn the protocol on his own ground without her presence. He had learned it. By the morning of October 8, 1985, the Bachmann 840 acres were drilled. By the morning of October 22nd, the emergence had reached uniform 2-leaf stage across 97% of the planted acres. Ernst had driven over to the Friesen kitchen on the evening of October 22nd with a handwritten report on a single sheet of lined notebook paper documenting the emergence count. Verna had read it at the kitchen table with him. She had said, "Ernst, that is the cleanest emergence count I have ever seen on a first-year heritage stand. Your father would be proud of you." Ernst had nodded. He had not spoken. He had driven home. He stood at the open wooden gate of the Friesen home place block. He looked at the freshly emerged turkey red seedlings. He looked back at Verna, who had walked out from the milk house with the leather seed register in her arm. He took off his tall, crowned, cream-colored stockman's cowboy hat. He set it against his chest. "Verna, Gerhard, I owe my best friend's widow my farm. I owe my son's seed bill to a 1874 line my best friend's wife's great-great-grandfather carried across the Atlantic the year my own grandfather was born. I owe my friendship with Heinrich a debt I should have paid in 1976. I am asking forgiveness. I am asking it as a man who watched my best friend's widow for 9 years and decided that the easier thing was to assume she was wrong. I would like to come stand at this gate one Saturday afternoon a season and learn what I should have learned in 1976. Verna unlatched the gate. She held it open. She said, "Gerhard, you are forgiven. You were forgiven on the night Liesel sent you over here in October of 1976. You did not need to come today. I did need to come today, Verna. Then come walk the block." He came in. He walked the block with her for an hour. He looked at the seedling density. He looked at the row spacing. He looked at the heritage stand against the soft November light. He took the leather seed register from her hands. He read 3 pages of Hans Friesen's 1875 entries. He gave the register back. He drove home at dusk. The next Saturday, he came back. The Saturday after that, he came back. By the end of November 1985, he had come back 4 Saturdays in a row. He did not pay her for the visits. She did not ask him to. The Saturday visits became, in the Bachman and Friesen families, a thing that was understood and not discussed. They continued until Gerhard Bachman's death in 2001. The wooden gatepost at the south end of the Friesen home place block was named for him in his obituary in the Hillsboro Star-Journal. The Hillsboro Star-Journal ran a feature in its November 14, 1985 edition under the headline, "The Heritage Line That Saved the County." The article was 9 column inches on the front page and continued for 16 more inside. Linus Jansen was quoted. He said, "I worked beside Verna for 14 years. I knew the line was right by 1980. I should have spoken up then. I am sorry I waited until the Fusarium hit." Abraham Ratzlaff was quoted. He had grown up next door to Peter Friesen on the family section in the 1920s. His own grandparents had come over from the Alexanderwald village in the same 1874 emigration as Hans and Agnetha Friesen. He had attended the Hillsboro Mennonite Brethren Church every Sunday of his life until 1981, when his arthritis had stopped him from driving. He had bought 100-pound sacks of turkey red seed off Peter Friesen at $1.40 a bushel through the late 1950s, when most of his neighbors had been switching to commercial certified varieties. He had said, in his interview with the Star-Journal reporter, sitting at his own kitchen table with a tin of homemade peppernuts and a cup of black coffee, that he had heard his father Cornelius Ratzlaff say in 1923 that the day would come when the Mennonite community would owe its survival to one stubborn family who had kept the line. He had said the day had come. He had said Verna Friesen was that one stubborn family. He said, "I knew Peter Friesen. I knew his father Heinrich. I knew his grandfather Hans. I will say this once. The daughter is what the father was, and what the father was the most patient seed keeper this county has produced in 3 generations. I am sorry I did not say so in 1976. Gerhard Bachman was quoted. He said, "I owe my best friend's widow my section. I will spend the rest of my life trying to deserve to call her my sister." Dr. Margaret Klassen at Kansas State University was quoted. She said, "We have known about the Friesen operation since the spring of 1982. Mrs. Friesen asked us to keep her name out of the literature. We did. We are no longer going to. The Friesen operation is the foundation of pre-Green Revolution wheat genetic conservation in the state of Kansas. It is, as far as we have been able to measure, the longest continuous unbroken heritage line cultivation history in the United States. It has been quietly maintained for 110 years by 5 generations of one family on a single 60-acre block in Marion County. The article noted in its final paragraph that the Friesen operation had been the only viable wheat field in 8 townships of Marion County during the summer 1985 Fusarium head blight epidemic, that 30 central Kansas wheat farms had ordered turkey red heritage seed from the Friesen operation for the fall 1985 planting, and that the United States Department of Agriculture's National Plant Germplasm System had filed a formal collection request with Mrs. Friesen to establish a federal reference accession of the 1874 line for permanent storage at the National Center for Genetic Resources Preservation in Fort Collins, Colorado. The article did not note, because Verna Friesen had not told the reporter, that the sealed glass jar on the Friesen kitchen shelf had been bought at a Hillsboro mercantile in 1923 by her grandfather Heinrich Friesen for 35 cents, that the lard tin Hans Friesen had carried across the Atlantic in October of 1874 was still in the family attic in a small wooden chest beside an 1873 Mennonite Brethren hymnal, printed in German Gothic type, and that the seed Verna had drilled on the home place block in October of 1976 had been refreshed every single year between 1875 and 1976, without a single outcross, an unbroken line of 101 consecutive growing seasons of single-family stewardship, 480 pounds of seed, a 60-acre block on a Marion County section, a Mennonite seed keeper's daughter. The line nobody wanted in the hands of the woman nobody understood until they saw what an 1874 immigrant wheat could do in the worst Fusarium summer central Kansas could remember. She farmed the home place for 21 more years. She ran the heritage seed business from 1985 until 2006, when her nephew, Conrad Friesen, son of her late brother and a 1979 graduate of the Kansas State University Agronomy Program, came home from a private wheat breeding job in Saskatchewan to take over the operation. By the end of her career, more than 400,000 pounds of Friesen turkey red seed had been distributed to farms across Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, and southwestern Missouri on more than 700 working operations. The 1874 line is now held in formal conservation status at the National Plant Germplasm System under the accession designation Friesen Turkey Red 1874. The original sealed glass jar her grandfather bought at the Hillsboro Mercantile in 1923 sits today in a glass-fronted cabinet in the kitchen of the home place. The Friesen Turkey Red 1874 accession at the USDA National Center for Genetic Resources Preservation in Fort Collins has been requested for breeding program access by 22 land-grant universities and 7 international wheat breeding institutions since 1986. The federal accession holds in its original deposit 2 pounds of the original 1985 Verna Friesen harvest seed in a sealed glass vial labeled in her own hand. The seed inside the vial is, by every available genetic measurement, indistinguishable from the 1873 Crimean Foundation stock Hans Friesen carried across the Atlantic in October of 1874. Verna Friesen did not explain why she chose the line, not because the why was hidden. The why had been sitting in a sealed glass jar on a Kansas Mennonite kitchen shelf since 1923, and before that in a lard tin since 1874, waiting for a great-great-granddaughter who would carry it down to the section on the first Saturday of October 1976 and drill it on the same ground Hans Friesen had drilled it on in September of 1875, the year after his ship docked at Castle Garden. If you have ever drilled seed that crossed an ocean, leave a comment below telling us what it was. And if this story stayed with you, subscribe and ring the bell. There is one of these stories in every county in America. We are working through them, one harvest at a time.